in media res, and of course you decide that you don't want to speak anymore.
Oh, I was just letting you hit record because I got made fun of for starting a conversation, hitting record midway through. Gio Pinochet did that. I was like, oh, like Joe Rogan. I'm like, I'm like, you're not the one who bullies me. I'm the one that bullies you. Actually.
Well, this is Canon Fodder, episode 60, live from the south of France and really the global south in general. With me is my neighbor to the north, Mr. Dimes. How are you, sir?
And I'm doing great. I'm excited to be here. I love this show.
I love this show too, and unfortunately, I think this will probably be the swan song of the show if I even try to hit upload on YouTube after we're done.
Dude, if I had a dime for every time one of my friends did an episode with me saying, this one's not going up on YouTube, you know what they'd call me?
Nichols.
I was running that in my head, but I'm wondering what he's going to say. If he says Nichols, I'm gone.
Yeah, well, and there you go. I'm up to date on the lore and the blood satellite chat. Even though like I'll put down the Telegram chat for like 5 seconds, and then there'll be like 2,000 messages, and I'm like, all right, there's no catching up with this.
It's you can't up scroll. There's been so many times I just see the newest one and jump like near the end of a contentious debate, and just like giving an opinion, not knowing what's been addressed.
Yeah, well, I remember when I first joined, I was somebody was talking about vacuums, and I stuck my stupid head in talking about how I liked my Dyson vacuum, and that one and that one guy would like I think he wanted to ban me, or he wanted to murder me, come to my house, burn it down, and then vacuum my rug.
Yeah, I've had to reverse a lot of bans in that chat. That's how we keep the human capital elite in there. But it's one of the most active communities I think I've ever seen, and it's due to a lot of very well curated personalities. Anyway,
Speaking of elite human capital, we're going to talk about The Camp of the Saints by Jean Raspiel.
Only real Canon Fodders will appreciate the irony and get the reference of that quote right there. This is what happens when elite human capital wins.
Oh, God, no.
So if you wanted to give some background on the book, Camp of the Saints, a lot of people might be familiar with this title. And this is one of the most requested books I've gotten from friends of the show, Blood Satellite. And I never got around to it. I've been getting this for months and months, maybe even years. And I wanted to, and it just kept getting pushed back further and further. And then I finally got around to it because I had a good friend that I could talk about it with. Because I think you need to discuss this book between two or more people who have read it. Its reputation precedes it.
Oh, most definitely.
Maybe not as much as some of the other books in this category. I guess we would call it race war fiction. But some people will rank it up with the Turner Diaries or something like that. But I would say this stands apart from all that. I think it has a bit more to offer the reader. I think it's written a bit better.
It's so well written, and we're reading in translation. Unless you're in Canada, you might read French.
No, we don't read regular French. We read Quebec French up here, so it's probably closer to Italian. But yeah, I'm reading the translation. We might be working from different copies. I don't know how many different translations there are, but relatively short book. I'd say, maybe for fiction, it's about
300 pages, maybe.
Yeah. I went into this sort of blind, not knowing what to expect. I knew what people had discussed before, like, oh, it's about mass migration. It's about mass migration into France. And this was written in the 70s. And I think the fact that it's written in the 70s has to sit high on people's minds when people will say it predicted the future. Mm-hmm. But the context in which it was written, the Soviet Union still exists. So that factors in pretty heavily to the story. The Vietnam War, I believe, is still ongoing. I would need to, because when was it written? Like 1972 or something?
72 it was written, 73 it was released. So yeah, I mean, it probably, Vietnam was pretty much over by then. I think the Paris Peace Conference was 73.
Yeah, because it mentions Hanoi, and it mentions, like, there's references to Vietnam and this sort of third worldist regime. But it's difficult for me to figure where to jump in. Like, do we want to just get to like the meat of it? So let me just start by asking this: did you like it?
I
And what?
did.
Yeah.
I thought that I thought this was gonna be like kind of a slog, it's like, oh, it's the meme book, people are gonna like I'm doing this for you, I'm doing this for the audience. But I actually it was a good read. I'm gonna put it on my Goodreads. And
Yeah, and I think it's the reputation preceding it does it a disservice because it's knowing the political waters that we swim in. Maybe we're just used to a lot of this language and these scenarios, but it wasn't as vulgar as I was expecting. And I'm just going to give sort of the bullet points of my takeaways. If you'd asked me when I was halfway through reading it if I liked it, I would have said yes. This is an amazing book, and it haunts you. It's chilling, and it's not necessarily because it's gory or even particularly graphic. There's some gross scenes in it, and we'll get into that in a second. But by the end of it, because I'd finished it this past weekend, I had softened a bit on it. I didn't love it as much. I like the first half more than the back half, and we can get into it.
I will say it had a good ending.
I was expecting something else, not a twist necessarily, but something more. And in the first half of the book, it surprises you with how layered it is. So I'll tell you one thing I wasn't expecting, and you let me know what you think about this. I wasn't expecting the amount of spirituality that was woven throughout this.
Yes.
And mentions of God, yeah.
Yes, it mentions of God. And not in a ham-fisted way either, in a very not nuanced, but in a very mature way. It's clear that Respiel, I think it is. He has at least a decent understanding of Scripture and of God, and it's funny because it's usually coming from the mouths of his atheist characters.
Yes, that's a great point. I'd had one of our listeners was a big fan of the book, said that it was pretty harsh on Christians, and I did not interpret it that way.
Catholics specifically.
One could even, Catholics, I would say,
and
yes.
The Jesuits, the Jesuits are up to their tricks.
But if anything, more of a sort of liberal humanism that has infected these religions because God is present in this. In fact, much of what occurs in the book could be, it's almost explicitly described as something like solemn providence. Mm-hmm. That God is, yes, sir. Continue.
Oh, sorry. No, I was going to say, you could say that it's like, it's like one of the plagues that Moses tells the Pharaoh about in order to liberate the Israelites. This is clearly a punishment from God.
Yeah, and so the setup of the story, and we don't need to go into too much detail, going beat by beat, but I will say what it's about. It's a horde, 1 million strong, of Indians.
Only 1 million?
Well, it's less than 1 million by the time the boats get there, because it's something like 800,000 by the time the boats land from India to France. And it's India specifically, meaning that I noticed that the book, there's a third worldist global south sentiment in this, but this horde's from India, and it doesn't really group the Muslims or the Arabs or the Persians in with that.
And they have their own boats. Right.
But by the end of it, it's become a global movement of even the Chinese doing the same sort of mass migration. The Chinese peasants, these are the underclasses. These are the scum of the earth from China going into the Soviet Union. Then Africa joins in. Then it doesn't mention Mexico, I don't think, but the Philippines. It starts echoing throughout the world. And there's sort of global revolution of the third world moving into the first world and taking over. But the one we're describing, it's from India, from the Ganges, and they're described as Indians, and the way they're described in this is horrific.
Yeah, really, they almost don't seem human.
Well, because there is mention in the book of Indians and people from that part of the world who are defectors from India who try and side with the French.
The Uncle Toms of,
And they hate the Indians the most, and you've seen people like that. And they're just specifically described in the book as like the worst of India, the gutter of India. They're the ones who want out the most, and it's interesting. If I had to describe the Horde, I wouldn't even say it's the primary antagonist of the book, because people will think, oh, this is like man versus zombies. The zombies are the antagonist. And it's very clear early on that they're just a phenomenon being described, and the real villains are the race traders,
the secular humanists, the communists, really just the haters of anything beautiful. You see in the very beginning, there's the French professor who is just kind of having his last little hurrah. He's got his dinner out, he's having a drink, and he decides he's going to murder this punk because
he's sitting in a village it paints a very vivid picture, and we just say that right now, that the prose in this is wonderful. That it meditates on where it should, especially in the first half of the book. I really love the first half of the book for this, describing, picturesque, his sort of a house, a homestead that's been in his family since the 1500s. He lives there alone, and then the entire village is abandoned. And he's sort of like the Roman centurion of the legionnaire at the end of Spangler's.
Pompeii,
yeah, sort of just standing guard, because at this point, everyone has sort of resigned themselves to failure, and this is sort of his last stand as a Western man. And sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, that scene where he's just going through the house and he's talking about, the invention of the fork, whereas like the fork was invented how many years ago, and these people still eat with their hands, or he's talking about the linens that have been in his family for so long and have been packed away, and they smell like lavender that either his mother or his grandmother put in there. And there's this kid, he's like this anarchist who is going to lead the Horde right to his doorstep so that he can kind of watch it all burn down. And the professor just shoots him. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Like
and for people who've seen the meme, there's a quote that circulates from this book where it doesn't attribute it to anyone, but it's like, they'll be tired, they'll hungry, they'll make a fire of your nice wooden door. It's said by this kid who's in this abandoned village, saying that, hey, old man, I'm gonna, and just the way he describes it, there's these long, I would call them monologues, where you really understand the psychology of these villains, these antagonists, various anarchists. Like you had said, there's journalists in here, politicians, cardinals and clergymen, people who are on the side of this third world, this revolution. And in fact, they are the main instigators of it. It would not happen if not for them. And they're friends of this revolution on both sides. So we're in France, but there's people there. And I'd made a comment on the driving force of these antagonists before, and I think it's extremely important that this book was set in France and written by a Frenchman, because one thing I had said, and an idea I'm playing around with, is that revolutions are never truly over. No revolution ever recedes from the current zeitgeist, and France in particular, I don't think France has ever moved on past the French Revolution. And if you go to Paris, if you go to France, you will see the echoes of that still in their architecture, and I believe in their character, even though it's been over for how long. So I think what's going on in this book, it's an echo of the French Revolution. You have these revolutionaries, you have the Jacobins, you have these sort of petite Robespierres who are not even necessarily on the side of the third world, but they are against the bourgeoisie.
Right.
And
they're
when
just against France.
When you hear them talk, they're speaking of this. They think they're just an unwashed, disgusting horde too, but they're speaking with glee at what they will do to your nice wooden doors, to your linens, to this country that they. And each one of them has a reason. Maybe they feel betrayed by it. Maybe they feel that they don't belong in this country. So it's like, this is their revenge. And the third world horde is just a cudgel they're using. And then as the story goes on, each one of these characters and Christ, I think there's like a dozen of them throughout the
Yeah.
book. They each meet their fate. And a recurring theme in this book, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but I think it's good to get it out of the way now. A recurring theme of the book is how they realize too late what they have done, and they all pretty much die miserable and sad and regretting it.
Right. There's the one scene. He's the white savior guy who is like whipping up the crowds to get onto the boats, and he gets crushed by them.
Yeah, that's an amazing scene.
To death.
Yeah.
Well, no, sorry. There's the guy that gets crushed to death. This guy I'm thinking of gets knocked off the gangplanks, and actually, he's the atheist one, like the really atheist one, who gets knocked off the gangplanks and realizes that he messed up, so he intentionally drown. He doesn't even try to save his own life.
Yeah, and this is the water of the Ganges River, and so it's described as being putrid and black, and it's full of corpses. And then there's Indians being knocked off the gangplank, but because they have no respect for life and that they don't care. And there's scenes in the book of them just kind of surrendering to death, like who gives a shit. So it's just this poisonous swamp, and then you really feel like he's overcome by something worse than death. The other one you're describing, there's this one striking
He's a priest.
scene. Yeah, he's either a priest
or no, a bishop. He's a bishop.
There's the one guy who fires the gun,
right?
And he's described like he was on the side of this thing, then he turns against it right at the end. He was an ambassador or a consul of some kind.
Yes, he was the Belgian consul.
That's right,
and he had the army of Sikhs.
That's right.
The Sikhs do not come out well in this either.
Yeah, and so he has one last stand. He fires one shot he hits one of them, but then he's just stomped and beaten to death. And on the boat, this wretched old massive, one of many boats, but like the biggest one, I believe it's like the Bombay Star or something like that. There's a few of these. I'm just going to keep calling them race traders because that's how they're described in the book. There's a few sympathizers on this boat too, and they're watching the dock as the boat goes away. And this man's been reduced to like a puddle of mush. And they describe a bunch of dogs just licking him up. And again, it's not terribly gory, but there's this little line there that really stuck with me. And it sets the tone for the rest of the book, where he says he thinks he sees the dog writing something in Latin on the ground in the blood, and he doesn't know exactly what it says, but that establishes again a theme later on of God is involved in this. God, right. There's these little miraculous events, and truly the fact that this travel takes place at all is miraculous. Like there's a 1,000 ways these ships should have sank, and then they just don't. It's like it's impossible that they get to their destination, but that is in fact what happens.
There's of course the turd eater, who is the lowest of the low, and his son, which is described as a monster.
Yeah,
he suddenly is just like this amazing speaker, and he's quoting scripture. He's quoting Apocalypse.
It's this wild. One of the most interesting characters in the book. He's called the Turd Eater, and he's described. I kind of want to set the entire scene where he's introduced because I love this scene.
Sure.
And this is at the consulate, the Belgian consulate. And this is near the beginning of the book. It opens, and there's a mass of people at the gate to the consulate because Belgium, as with many nations in Europe, France included, they had offered these people like amnesty to children. They'll take in children, they'll adopt children, and there's a lot of people in the West who want to adopt these children. And so what that inspired was all these wretched pieces of refuse to have babies for the purpose of giving them away for adoption, hoping that would be their ticket to the West. But it's this really, upsetting scene where, the fattest, the plumpest, most beautiful babies are at the front, and these women are pleading, and this one woman, she's got this speech, and tears are streaming down her face. She's describing how much she has sacrificed to raise this baby, even letting one of her own uglier kids die. So two of
her daughters die.
Yeah, to fatten this one up because they said this is our ticket. And she's like, I'm I've given this baby enough. I want to eat now. So you've got this. There's a lot that's kind of bound up in that scene. One is these people describing like how they just see their children as tickets to the West in a way, even though it's a long shot. But then also they don't even care for their children. Like, I just don't want this fucking baby anymore. And that's what they're saying to this guard, the Sikh guard, the Sikh guard, that's how they're described, on the other side of the gate. But then the most beautiful babies at the front. But as you recede back into the crowd, they get uglier and uglier and uglier until the very, very back of the crowd, there's just this giant, this dark-skinned giant holding this mutant baby aloft, described as having these stumps for arms and a flap for a mouth and just these crazy eyes. Like, it sounds like a monstrosity. It almost sounds like a sketch.
And they call him the monster. Or the book calls him the monster.
Yeah, and this giant man is called the Turd Eater because he's one of the untouchables. His entire life, his entire caste is living in the gutter and making bowls and things out of shit and trying to sell it. And he eats shit quite literally. So it's like, this is the worst entity one could imagine. He's illiterate, he's huge, and he's violent. However, he becomes something, I don't want to call him a Christ-like figure, but almost, and not an antichrist either, but like their version of a Christ. But there's some kind of mysticism that speaks through him.
Maybe anti-Messiah.
Yeah, but like you said, all of a sudden he's quoting.
Christ means Messiah, so
yeah,
maybe an antichrist is right.
He's quoting scripture, and this abomination child seems to hold sway over people. They look towards it, and so he's got this power over people and becomes just their leader. And this entire time, the whole revolution to invade the West has not occurred yet. It is instigated, as I said, by these actors who are trying to funnel these people, these Indians, onto these boats.
These non-government organizations are facilitating this times. Where have we seen this before?
Exactly. And then that's one of the, if you imagine this in the 70s, this would sound like bombastic nonsense. This is like, this would never happen. Now, if you read this, of course, the 2025 eyes, this is literally happening. There's some aspects it gets a little wrong, but other than that, it's line for line how this would happen. If there's one, we'll get into the actual invasion later on, but I just wanted to.
I mean, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt of 50 years. Well, yeah. I guess 40 when mass migration really hit off or became an issue in 2011.
Yeah,
that's when I remember like seeing the videos. With various. I don't even remember them at this point, but they all kind of blend together where it's just, these people arriving from the Mediterranean and then being fed, rations, war rations. And they're like, what is this? I was promised, milk and honey and stuff like that. Like,
yeah,
I remember the entitlement and I'm just like, this topic gets me very charged.
Yeah. Well, you would get very emotional and passionate reading this because it aligns with your reality, especially once we get into the end, like you said, the NGOs, but also the journalists, the entire media apparatus in France. It's described in great deal as trying to suppress the information about what's going on. And I would say that leads us, that's from like the middle part of the book. After this fleet has set sail, there's news coming in about it, and they must make it so people don't understand what's going on in these boats. They're selling a story that these are all women and children, and they want to breathe free, and they're just like us. In reality, I mean, this is probably the most disgusting part of the book, in my opinion, where it describes what's going on that fucking ship,
right?
The main one, like, like there's orgies and shit. Like, you need to understand that. You take the people of the lower classes from the Ganges, then you enclose them in this tight space for, I think it's like 3 months.
Orgy is not the word I would use because that implies that there's some sort of consent.
It's some kind of sexual
rape.
mass rape, but it's like man on man and child on woman and woman on man. It's this just massive flesh. You might imagine hell is like this. Yeah, there's no consent here because everyone's in such tight quarters. It's just this reeking, stinky, sweaty mass. Because at this point, they're shoulder to shoulder. They're just kind of boiling rice, and then they run out of wood. They run out of anything to boil the water, so they end up drying out their own shit. They end up like collecting shit, baking it in the sun, and then burning that
We'll
shit.
do as we've always done,
Yeah, we'll do as we always do. That's one
as
of the
the
quotes.
ancestors did
So
in the before times.
there's this a few lines, quite a few lines, where if anyone's familiar with the phrase "imagine the smell,"
Oh.
they say that in the book. Like they send airplanes and helicopters over these fucking boats, and like it's just hitting us like a punch in the face. Like we can't fly over this fleet because it's like people on a shore 100 miles away are like, holy fuck, what is that smell? Because it's like burning shit and just sweaty Indians. But
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, you go ahead. Go ahead.
No. There's this one scene where the French government is trying to figure out what they're going to do about this, and all the ministers have no testicular fortitude at all, right? They're just like, we can just keep them at sea forever, and we'll give them to the UN, and there'll be an island nation at sea. It's what we've always done. We got to make sure we break up the fleet in half so that one half hates the other, and they can never talk to each other, and it'll be just like we've always done before. And everybody's like trying to talk themselves into this, but there's this one junior sort of administrator who's like, no, I have 10 serious solutions for this, but you people are just not, you're not serious people, so you're not going to take my advice. And he machine guns the room.
Yeah, that was great. Like throughout the book, there are these individuals who understand what's going on and understand what must be done to correct it, and they are sort of shoved out of society, and they find each other by the end of the book. But there's certain these heroes who just, I think there's a Captain Notorious who they come across one of the boats. Like some of these boats, the smaller ones, are already beneath the water line. They're just trudging along. And one of them is sort of upturned, and there's just bodies in the water, thousands and thousands of bodies. And they're like, well, we must stop and we must pick them. And then he just doesn't want to and just goes full steam ahead and just runs them all over and just churns them up into chum. And he's just smiling the whole time. And he's tried as a war criminal. But as the book goes on, it's like, well, he had the right idea. Like there's various people on there like, well, what could you do? You can't bring them on your boat. They'll overrun the boat. It's like, you know what? Yep, he did the right thing. And just like South Africa is, as the fleet is going around the Horn of Africa and all, because it takes a long time. It takes like 3 months, something like that, maybe even longer. They're thinking along
50 days.
Yeah, they said there's all these countries along the way. They'll deal with it. They're not going to get to France, so they're hoping South Africa does something, and it doesn't. They just basically say, if you land here, we will shoot you. We'll destroy your fucking boats, and they're treated as a global pariah. How dare apartheid state? South Africa should be punished. What we would say now, right?
Well, so here's one thing, right? In the Camp of the Saints version of things, right? South Africa's probably still around. Rhodesia's probably still around.
Yeah, and there's an apartheid state, and everyone kind of makes not a mockery, but makes a monster out of them, and then they're forgotten. And then I think they go to the Suez Canal. I think that's the one, and then. What countries? I want to say it's Iran, but it's not Iran.
Egypt.
Yeah, Egypt. They're like, okay, the Egyptians will take them in because they'll like that place more, but they militarily turn them away at risk of blowing up. So like it's passing the buck. The entire world is passing the buck to France, daring them to do something, and the story is they wait until it's too late. That's really the story. It's like by the time they want to fight back, by the time the president of France is basically saying, we can't let them in, they're there. and then the towns and villages are abandoned. And there's been little flashpoints for the nation of, and this is where the third worldist and global south story comes in, that there's the unions of the fucking janitors and shit, all the Jamaicans in
Yes.
France, they're siding with them. And
Right.
you know
They're all, and they're waiting in the lurch. They're I think there was a really good phrase that Respiel used. I think that's like the third different time, or yeah, the third different time I've pronounced his name. But anyway, where these guys are the Jamaicans, the black people, all the global south of France are waiting at the radio for the president's speech, and they're going to attack and riot if they're if they if what happens if what they think is going to happen happens, where the president actually stands up and says no, we're not taking them in. uh, and there's one line in particular where he says something like, and France, because she gave away all her menial jobs stupidly, is now held hostage by them. Very
yeah,
very much like in Fight Club, and they're pissing in the soup, and it's like, these are the guys that wash your car and pick up your laundry, and like, don't fuck with them, and it's like,
yeah,
yeah,
it's
you
the
have a
same thing happened
whole.
in Rome when the sheer number of the slaves, was unignorable. Any decadent society where there's such a swelling underclass, eventually they realize, and that's a fault of the system. That's why these revolutions can take place. And that's one of the another theme of the book, which is that, even though there is violence in it and there are these very, terrible scenes that happen, there's no mass violence per se. The idea is that the war's already over. By the time the fleet arrives, France has essentially surrendered. And that's really the story here, that the Western world does not put up a fight. There is no race war. The fleet arriving is the conquering of the nation. They just move into these villages and these towns where the inhabitants have fled. And there's only tiny resistance from some of the main characters we've come to understand in the book, who group together by the end, sort of a last defiant stand. But
It's
that's about it.
so it's one guy versus a million people.
And they know they're going to die, and they take out a couple hundred by defending this village. But really, it's not like armies clashing by the end of it. It's a fleet of refugees, and this is what happens. When when you look at the collapse of the Bronze Age and these great cities. What's interesting is that some people will blame it on the arrival of the sea people that was spoken of in history, but that was sort of, they weren't a conquering Viking horde of any sort of stripe. Really, that was just like the last step of a civilization that had already started to decay due to its own internal inertia. Plus, it was subjected to several natural disasters and earthquakes. So really, they were just like refugees, sort of like these Indians. Like, they move in because there's no one to defend the borders, and because no one gives a shit anymore, and that the inertia of the nation is just it. They just move in on the land, and no one's there to defend it. Which is, if you're going into this expecting the Turner Diaries, where it's like guerrilla war in the streets or anything like that, or terrorism, like, it's not that. It's deeper, and I would say more relevant to our situation right now.
The West goes quietly into the night. It's no bang, but there is a whimper. It's just so. You can't imagine that this would have happened pre-Second World War, pre-First World War.
Yeah, and all of the villains get their comeuppance, but it doesn't matter because the villains die, but then everyone does. Like, there's one really tragic figure. It's this guy. He's a songwriter, I believe, and his wife, who's like a Happa woman. And they're celebrating. They're almost like communists. Like, they're celebrating the communist revolution. They think that the third world will bring in a socialist sentiment, more socialist than they've already got. And they're driving their fast car, and they're laughing in soldiers' faces, telling them to turn back. And they end up in this town that's overrun by prisoners because all the prisons have been emptied. You know, there was without much of a fight. It's just everyone. You know, that's another theme in the book, which is that all the police, all the military, all the authoritarian forces, they just got the memo that things are falling apart, and then half of them just leave. So the entire structures begin to decay. Anyway, the prisons are emptied, and then these two people, the entire book, you've been hearing about them, you know, trying to, you know, propel this forward, and they're laughing in the faces of everyone saying you're going to get what you deserve. So they go to this bar, and you know, this is a guy who has defended migrants his entire life. He's written columns, he's written books about it, and some of them even recognize him and say, he's one of us, drink. And then they get drunk, and then they just gang rape his wife and trap him in a room upstairs, and he's just like crying his eyes out for hours and hours. Then they let him out. His wife is naked, committed suicide by pills, and then he just wanders down to the beach. Yeah, like the bad guys get their comeuppance, but you don't feel good about it, and also we all lose, and that's really that keeps happening throughout the book. It's like, yep, all the ones on side of this end up just stomped into
the
puddles.
one scene of the Algerians experimenting on the young French women.
Oh yeah, basically, because here's another thing they do in the book, and I don't know if I like this. You tell me what you think, and this is just from a prose perspective. That throughout the book, he'll be describing someone or their fate, and he'll actually open with what happens to them at the end, and then describes what happens, almost like spoiling the ending of it. And he does that all throughout the book.
It was a little jarring because you're like, oh, I've already read this, you know, and
Yeah, like
and
he'll say
then,
this. He'll say, you know, this person was burned to death, and then he'll describe for like a page and a half about who they are, then what led to them burning to death. I'm like, okay, well, I kind of, you know, you spoil it. Maybe that's good though. It happened enough where it's on purpose. I just don't know if that made the book any better. Similarly, and this is what I was getting to, throughout the book, he'll flash forward in time because he's writing this from the perspective of someone from this world. You know, this is like an autobiography someone is writing of a period of time. And then as he's describing it, he's flashing forward to present day, letting the reader know that it didn't turn out well, letting them know that the sort of revolution was successful. And that destroyed the tension for me because for the first half of the book, it's building all this tension, this mystery of what is going to happen when this boat arrives. And it's very effective at doing that, except when it pings you with the reality that, yep, and then they get there and then nothing good happens. But I'm like, I wish it didn't do that. What do you think?
maybe part of it is just that French nihilism where it's like, don't have hope. Like, I'm gonna take that from you right away. There's no point in you having any sort of delusions that it turns out all right.
Now, you had said you liked the ending, and I'm gonna, like I said, I like the first part of the book more. I was hoping for something more when the boats arrived on the shores of France. So they all arrive, they all land, and then, you know, there's thousands who died on the boats, and so corpses are washing up on shore. And I don't know what I was expecting, and I don't want to say I wanted a twist or a rug pull from the story, but what ends up happening is, they just file off the ships, and then they kind of swarm into the countryside, and then the most predictable thing happens. But I was just hoping for something miraculous or weird to happen, like the boats get there and they're all dead or something, you know.
See,
like
that's why I liked the ending, because it doesn't pull that punch. You know, there's certain books that it's like a dive bomb or a dive bomber, right? Coming at you, excuse me, coming at you, and the whole time you're just hoping that it pulls up, pulls up, pulls up, and it doesn't, and it releases the bomb and it kills you. And a lot of people don't have the stomach to follow through on their massive. It would ring fake to me if there was some sort of miraculous save at the end, you know?
not even a save, but because I know what you're thinking I'm saying, but I'm not saying that, not like, oh, and then everything's okay, but just something else because it builds up that sort of divine providence throughout the entire book, and then it just sort of abandons them. I don't know. Like it was just
Well, no, because the provident, like, God's punishment is met out. Like,
yeah. I don't know.
you're not gonna get away. You're not gonna get away with it.
It just felt that the entire back half of the book was on a descent, whereas the first half it was a very interesting ascent. And then and then the last stand of like the fact that all these main characters just met each other at the end. I'm like, that's kind of hokey. You know what I mean? Like then,
I don't know. I liked it because it showed it showed some. I think it was a realistic portrayal of what's probably going to end up happening, unfortunately, where you're going to have the majority of normal society just succumb to this fate, and you have a few online shit posters who might meet up IRL and try and create society, and maybe fail at it.
What I liked about the part again where the boats were about to hit France is the way it was describing the transformation of the inhabitants of the ship. Where, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it says that when they set sail, they were driven by something like vengeance, like a quest for the land of milk and honey, as you describe. And it was hostile, and they continue to be more and more hostile on the ships throughout the journey there, because at various points these religious groups, the Catholics and the Protestants, both try and like race each other to give aid, and these other countries are trying to give them aid, and they get the food and the medicine on the boats, but they reject it. They throw it over the side, and they're rushing to try and justify, like, what could they mean by this? It couldn't be that they just hate us. They must be confused. They must have thought we were the bad guys trying to poison them. But there's a point, and I forget exactly where this was, but they described that the hostility and the anger had just melted away. They weren't hateful anymore. They were something else. And it was such an interesting view of race, where on the way there, they could be seen as sort of like anti-white. They were all united. It didn't matter that they were Indian. It was just this, there's white people, Europeans, and then everyone else united against them. But by the time they land, they don't even see themselves as reacting to whites. And the quote was something like, they are the only race. That they don't see themselves in the shadow of anyone else. They've been driven mad by their time on the ship, and they already started off pretty deranged and diseased. But by the time they're there, they're not even fucking human anymore. They're driven by something else. They don't even know what they are, but it's just this like one organism moving forward. And I thought that was an interesting way of describing them. Like they're not anti-white. They're the only race on Earth by the time they land.
And in some ways, it's quaint. The book is cute in its portrayals of what could happen, because at the end, it's like, what, 800,000 people make it off these boats. It's like, oh, that's a good year in the United States.
Yeah, by the end of it, they set up like that horde specifically takes over a certain part of like southern France, I think, but it triggered these other revolutions throughout the world, and it doesn't give details on that. It's not a geopolitical forecast. He glosses over that part because he should. You can spiral.
The last nation is
Switzerland, yeah, where the author is writing from, sort of the last bastion, but then even that is beginning to fall. Even that is opening its borders, succumbing as every other nation did to its own internal treachery, saying that eventually it's destined to fall unless you're choosing armed combat. And that's sort of the other message of the book, which is like, you need to shoot your way out of this. And if failing that, there is no solution to this.
I was surprised because you hear all the memes about, like you said, this book's reputation precedes it. I was surprised that they had a Soviet Russian perspective in the book at all, And I thought that was very telling that the Russians were giddy to get revenge on the Germans in the Second World War, but they balked at shooting Chinese women and children.
Yeah, and also, you would think, oh, the Soviet Union would be the most open to these. No, 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 no. They didn't want the Chinese entering there either.
No, no,
Like,
and they were giving, and they all they wanted was quote unquote Siberia. Like the thing about Russia is that it's massive. You can fit the whole global South and never know that they were there. You
yeah,
know,
but you forget that, looking at the communists from our perspective, if you're caught up in the discourses on X, you would think that the entire Soviet Union was just like, danger-haired campus progressives. But no, these were serious men that were extremely pragmatic. Like, they wouldn't be swinging open the doors of their nation for theory purposes, like any of these people. Like, so
oh
they
yeah,
were
no,
having the same conversations that the United States was having.
there was the two Soviet, like, I think one was a colonel and the other was maybe a general. And he's talking about, it's like, oh man, if I have to hear these guys in their broken Russian talk about Soviet theory or communist theory, I'm gonna just shoot myself. There's not enough vodka for that.
And he was very drunk, and they all got very drunk on vodka. Some people might think that's a trope. I just think that's a real thing that would happen all the time.
Yeah, no, he talked about, he's like, well, if I'm gonna kill all these people, I'm gonna have to do it completely drunk. And the guy
Oh, what
responds,
was that line? There was that great speech, and this was early on too, where he said all the great wars in history were fought by drunk people.
right, right, all it was all drunkards. And the guy replies, he's like, well, there's no respect for drunken soldiers anymore, or something to that effect. uh
Yeah, I was missing more of that. I thought there was more conversations, more, here's a word for you, diverse conversations earlier on. I liked those conversations more than what I got at the end. Again, I'm not trying to rag on the end too much, but some of these characters just fade away, like the turd eater. He arrives and his child arrive on the shores of France and then kills one of the guys and then sort of just disappears. Then by that point we're just fading into the end of the story. But yeah, it just sort of fades into nihilism, as you described it.
and maybe
There's
that's the good
there's,
ending.
there's one fate I'd like to also describe before I forget. I'm
Sure,
sorry.
sure.
There's one. What's his name? He's the soldier, but he has a specific name. You remember, like the ranger or something?
No, I don't.
He defects from the army, and it's like him versus the regular army, and then he's like a communist or a Marxist in some sense. I want to find his name here. Anyway, I'll look it up later. But they arrive on the shores to welcome the horde with a bunch of other villagers, these well-off people, and then they're just shoved aside. And then they're, like, many of them swept up into the march of these people and then elbowed and almost trampled. But he fights his way out, and he notices on the faces of everyone there is no gratitude. They're there offering food, offering directions to supermarkets. They found supermarkets in these abandoned towns to direct them to. And it's just, they don't give a shit. There's like nothing in their eyes that they recognize, and no thank you and no appreciation, which is really what they wanted, because they were the white saviors
Right.
in this story. And then as he's being elbowed and fumbled through this crowd, he finds one of the old women there, and he saves her, and they get out of the crowd. He yanks her out, and he finally sees appreciation in her eyes, like a thank you, and he finally gets the appreciation, and it describes their life from there, because they were so excited about redistributing the wealth and all these ill-gotten gains from the bourgeoisie. And they describe them, they don't die, they live on as scavengers, and describes their days. They'll just go through a town and then look over the hall of the day, and it's like a fucking alarm clock here, a piece of old bread there, maybe a nice ruby ring or something. And they're like Gollum. They're described as like Smeagol from Lord of the Rings, just like hunched over in some kind of barn, like clapping, going hee hee hee. And
Yeah, they become what they always were.
Yeah, that's their dream. Their dream is just eking out a living with the crumbs of the elites. But that's all. He must cling to that. He must cling to the image of this like decrepit old woman happy, because that's the only gratitude he receives for the worst treachery imaginable to his nation, because this was a military leader we're speaking of right now. It takes a lot out of you, doesn't it? I know you.
It really does. I told you, I DM'd you. I was like, this book made me incredibly pissed off, and and you were like, that it's so bad, or what? And I was like, I I actually like what I wrote. So hold on, let me quote myself real quick. As I'm wont to do. Yes, I'm harboring a fleet of hatred for the third world and its benefactors.
Yeah, and again, it's clear that the enemies in this book are the NGOs, the journalists, the politicians, and you spend the most time with them throughout the book, hearing their conversations, hearing their justifications, hearing their lies and their strategies to get this thing done. And they get their comeuppance, but again, at what cost? Who gives a shit? And it's, like I said, very relevant to our current era. And I think that there's a good reason that this book is out of print. I'm not able to find.
I think they're printing new copies soon.
I remember like one of the print houses from our space. I forget which one. It might have been Imperium or Antelope
Hill.
One
Imperium.
Of them. They ran into problems getting the rights. At the time, there was something to do with whoever held the rights to this. They were blocking reprinting of it because this is a very difficult book to find. However, I do think, and these translations are available, if this was more widely read, this book, more than any others, has the possibility to radicalize the reader. And by radicalize, I don't even know what I mean. But I am saying, like, you will walk away from this book. Again, it's not just a lurid, gory tale of race war revenge. It's something deeper. It is something spiritual. It's not even necessarily a criticism of Christianity, although that factors into it. It's almost an affirmation of Christianity by showing how these church leaders, these cardinals, these pastors have betrayed their people and God punishes them for it. So it's not as simple as a lot of people might be led to believe.
Bad, Catholicism bad. Like, look at them. Like,
well, because the Pope,
the Jesuits are up to their tricks, even though they are.
Yeah, because the Pope is, he gets a lot of scorn in this book heaped upon him, but there's one line in the book that said any other era he would be labeled an anti-Pope and killed, right? So there's a recognition here that we are in historically unprecedented times, that these, leeches and these jackals are allowed to dominate the leadership class, and they're the ones responsible for it all throughout the world. And it doesn't take a lot of them to do it, is the idea. And of course, there's musicians and artists swept up in it, but they're not the ones driving it. They're just popularizing it. And there's that one song that's described all throughout the book. I don't know the lyrics exactly, but one of the refrains is, "And now the 1,000 years are over," saying, and there's imagery cooked up by the song about Jesus on the cross, and these Hindu gods approach him and remove the nails from his hands and his feet and bring him down from the cross. Christ is saved by these Indian deities, these Hindu gods.
Right. And then there's even a scene earlier on where the Indian deities leave Christ behind in India, and they say to him, "Well, if you're actually the Son of God, then walk out onto the water and come join us," and he ends up drowning.
Yeah. There's stuff like that I think it's you can really spend a long time diving into the imagery that's cooked up in this book, and so it was surprising how metaphysically complex it was, while also describing to you a ship full of stinking coming Indians that are cooking their own shit.
Now, quick question for you. How many times do you think Tom Homan has read this book? We know Stephen Miller loves this book.
How popular do you think this book is versus how they just bring it up and kind of gesture to it?
I think it is definitely one of the boogeymen for the left to kind of point at and say, "Oh, look at what the chuds are doing. Look at what they're reading. This is what they actually think." I think part of it. I think it was a bestseller in 2011 in France. So
yeah,
it's very widely read there. I would say that, I mean, yeah, I think there are some top people who know the score.
It's a good book, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And I haven't read the Turner Diaries. I'm probably going to end up reading that soon. But as I understand, it's not really like this.
No, it's not good. So do you know Cap?
Uh,
Capitalissimo?
yeah, I know him. Yeah.
Okay, so he and I do another show every week. We are reading Aberration in the Heartland of the Real, which is one of a schizo book about Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing, right? And just going over that conspiracy. And it's, it's a really long, thick book. It's a terrific read. I highly recommend it. And one of the things, she goes in depth about the Turner Diaries and McVeigh's obsession with it. So we talk about it for a little bit, and yeah, it's just not a good book. It's just not well written, and even Pierce himself said it wasn't meant to be well written.
Yeah. Well, also we on Blood Satellite, we did a whole arc on white nationalist literature, starting with Mein Kampf, and we didn't read the Turner Diaries, but we read this really fascinating biography. An investigative journalist spent some time with William Luther Pierce. It's called, I believe, The Fate of a Dead Man's Deeds.
Yes, because I listened to your most recent episode, and I think you referenced it then.
Yeah, it's really good. It's just here's what it was like to be William Luther Pierce on his compound. Here's the story of him. And the story, it intersects with the story of the Order or the Silent Brotherhood. And it talks about the Turner Diaries. He speaks of the Turner Diaries. And I think it must have sold something like 200,000 copies. Something fucking wild like that. Like 200,000 copies for a book. People, you get on the New York Times bestseller list for selling like 1,000.
Right.
Like the bar is very, very low for books because not a lot of people buy books. So imagine selling 200,000 copies through the mail. Like this was a massive book, which is wild to think about. And I wonder how Camp of the Saints would stack up, because it is, even though I haven't read it, I do suspect this is a better book.
It is a much better book. Would be really ironic because you can get knockoff books printed in India and then shipped to you.
No.
And you can actually have them, like you can buy them on Amazon. I have a book that I got I thought it was at discount, but then I look at it, I was like, oh, this was printed by just some guy.
Oh, we got to do it. We got to do this.
So just, get a $5 and ask him to print and mail you a book.
Yeah, if there's one thing I don't know how long you need this episode to be, but there's one thing I also wanted to mention.
I've got time, man. So,
and this will sound, I'm sure, extreme to regular people. I don't assume regular people listen to the show, but I do think the way they describe Indians in this is accurate. Because Jean Raspail, like he traveled the world when he was younger. And I think a lot of this was pulled from his travels, his experiences. And I don't know, a lot of white people love to go to India because they think it's the most spiritual place in the world. But you contrast that against, the Google Maps game where just drop a pin anywhere in India randomly and see if you can find one location that's not covered in shit and trash and it doesn't look like a war zone, right? So you're like, once you behold these people, and I do think they're an accurate description of what this specific class would be like, it is horrifying. If you're a Westerner, if you're a European, a white person, you know homeless people, sure, you know what the hood is like, but the hood is like the aristocracy compared to like the slums of India or these villages in Africa. I'm reading this book. It's a fascinating book called A Sex and Culture by Joseph Unwin, I believe. It was written in the 1930s. I believe it was released either by Antelope Hill or Imperium Press. They did a reprint of it. But it was just this anthropologist. The thesis of the book is that the level of civilization achieved by a tribe is directly correlated with its views on sex and chastity and marriage. And the more monogamous and chaste a tribe or society is, the more advanced it is. And it went all throughout fucking Polynesia, all throughout Africa, all throughout South America. And it's just a straight up anthropological say discussing these tribes. But you're reminded that these tribes exist. You're reminded that there's a lot of people in the world. You think of like the United States of America. That's a huge landmass. It's not packed as much as India is, right? There's so many people out there that are, if not cannibals, then pretty close. And they're huffing bags of their own shit. And they do think pedophilia is tolerable, or they don't have a word for pedophilia because it's just a thing that you do, and that you are just eating dirt mud. You know what I mean? Like you hear about Haiti. Haiti is not the fringe case. There's more places like Haiti.
The world is more like Haiti.
The world's more like Haiti than it is like France. And yet, when you talk about global south, that's mainly what we're talking about. There's parts of China that are very civilized. There's parts of the Middle East is sort of a special case where it's, very poverty stricken, but even the people there are not what you encounter in the ghettos of the Ganges, and it's mostly ghetto, and it's mostly just filth and these people, and you look in their eyes and there's nothing there. And as a Westerner, you're accustomed to logic and reason, and even if you're not an individualist, you understand that I should be able to build a human connection. That's what my secular humanist society tells me, but that does not map onto the rest of the world. Like you're talking, I don't want to call them animals, but it's something. Not only do you not speak their linguistic language, you don't speak their spiritual language, and you don't speak their psychological language. Like there's nothing you can maybe nod and give a thumbs up, and yeah, you both like rice, but there's a severe disconnect there.
There's because I keep my feet firmly planted in Normie land. There's a clip from the show Family Guy. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Geez, hit Lois.
There's they land in India, and Peter's talking about, he's like, India, the most spiritual place on earth. And he gets off the plane, he looks around, and it's exactly as you've described. And he says, God is not here. And they get back on the plane.
Well, and I see that, and everyone gets it. But then I watch a movie like The Darjeeling Limited by Wes Anderson, the director.
God. Well,
and I'm like, this
in the early 2000s when
but I'm like, it looks like it was filmed in India, and I'm like, I don't know, man, because it's a good story, but the backdrop is India, and I'm like, I don't know. Did you not experience India, or did you just? Like you hear Owen Wilson like, this is the most spiritual place in the world, man. I love these people. Are you being sarcastic? I don't know. Like I'm trying to figure out.
He hasn't been to India because there weren't 50,000 people on the train.
Yeah. I mean, I don't. Maybe there's. I think it's a love letter to British India.
Yeah.
Like that. It's not India. It's like a memory of India under the British Raj or something like that, without outwardly saying it, I guess.
That's the thing too. Is these cities that are left, right? They were built. They used Indian hands to build them, right? But they were the ideas. They were the planning of the British system, right? They're Mumbai, Calcutta, British cities, Delhi, British city, and just watching it become what it is. There are no new 5-story buildings being built in India. You know what I mean? Like even 5 stories. There's not. Why not? Why can't you? Why not? Why can't you just build something? Just build something.
Well, India's superpower by 2023. I don't know if you heard that.
I did know that. No, and it was 2020. You bigot. They got there. They sent a statue of Ganesh to the moon, and it maybe made it. Even
when I was at my least bigoted, when I was in my early 20s, you are what you are, but maybe you're as a self-respecting white man, I do have a love of the exotic. I have an interest in undiscovered countries, but even then I would gaze upon Ganesh or any of these gods and say, this is fucking dumb. Why do you have to pretend this isn't stupid? Even back then. And now I just look at, in Canada where I'm at, we've got an Indian colony over in Brampton, and they just built a 50-foot statue of one of their gods. And of course, it's like a half-naked monkey man. And I'm like, why do you guys are goofy. Do you know that? Like, do you seriously like this? I don't.
There's no way you believe this.
Like, don't tell me it's another guy about luck, about sexual luck. How many gods do you need for sexual luck? It's not working. That's why I tell Chinese people, you have all these rituals for luck. How much red have you been wearing your entire life? Red and gold. Are you any richer? It's not working. God frowns upon you.
I don't know. Like, you say that there's no sexual luck, but there's a billion of them.
I do wonder how
odd people. They don't like grow out of the soil.
Well, I think the book explained it pretty well how that happened on the ship. Like, it's not sex, as you know, which is that you seduce someone. It's just there's enough of you in a room, you form.
Oh no, something she bent over.
Something like a rat king. It's
God.
You're just descending. I assume it's like when you descend into a black hole, descending into an Indian hole. It just refracts, and it's just everyone going in and bending light, and you're twisting throughout time and space. And then children appear. It's a mind-bending reproductive process that it's difficult to study, I assume. But it's the only way to explain that many Indians, because who wants to fuck an Indian? I was doing so well.
We were doing all right, and I just brought it out of you.
If I could do, I'm doing my impression of T.R. Hudson. It's like, actually, I'm not sure that this is going to be on YouTube. I'm worried it won't be monetized. And I said, hey man, just let it ride. Let it ride, baby.
Well, letting it ride got us where we are.
What else can be? Would you recommend this book? Of course, you said you would add to the list, but any thoughts, any last thoughts on this book?
In some ways, it's info hazard. It's not something that I would recommend to normal people. But at the same time, it's if you're already in this thing, if you've already kind of had your eyes open to the way the world actually is, this book is you'll just kind of look at it like, oh, that's neat. Turns out that people have been on this for a long time. I wonder why we haven't done anything about this. And that's about it. Like, don't go searching this out if you're if you have a FanDuel account.
Could I read some quotes from the book?
Please.
I wrote down some segments that I was going to pepper in. I never got the chance, but I think people might find these interesting. So going back to the turd eater, this is early on in the book. It's a quote. It says, "And so," the turd eater continued, "the nice little god off his cross rubbed the feeling back into his arms and legs, shook them, twisted his neck a few times in every direction, and said, 'That's true.'" And this is Christ speaking to the Indian gods that rescued him. "That's true. I owe you my life, and I'm going to give you my kingdom in return. Now the 1,000 years are ended. The nations are rising from the four corners of the earth, and their number is like the sand of the sea. They will march up over the broad earth and surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city." So that is where the title comes from. The camp of the saints is the destination of this horde, this true, in their words, the true Christians of the world.
And what's interesting too is, like, right after I think it's Alan is his name. He's one of the characters who helped facilitated this. He says, yes, he's read his scripture somehow, but he omits the part where they're actually, death and famine and war, and like they're bringing the apocalypse.
Yeah, and there's another line here that describes Balin. It says, atheist though he was, Balin himself began to have some second thoughts as he heard the sudden clamor rise out of the crowd. Upon the bridge of the India Star, the turd eater lifted his hands toward the sky. He grasped his son by his two twisted stumps, and when he raised him high in the air with a signal-like flourish, each soul in the numberless mass thought he heard himself summoned by name. So this is how, like, almost a shockwave goes through the crowd, and they all decide to follow this one entity. Here goes. Back in the days of great national wars among the peoples who cared, the citizens used to tack up battlefield maps in their kitchens or parlors with little flag pins marking out the front, and every night they would move them or not, depending on the news. In France, at least, the practice died out as early as when the little paper flags were swept away, first by the winds of debacle and then by the winds of indifference. At the height of that war, not a soul, or almost, showed the slightest concern, an attitude piously passed down, father to son, from then on. The daily lap in Le Pensée Nationale, clearly suggesting a vast battlefield under attack by an advancing army, made so feeble an impression on the minds of the masses that the paper sales increased by not one single copy. So that's, the juxtaposition of old France versus now, how people, and I love hearing these stories, even in Britain, of how previous generations lived up until even the middle of the 20th century. Like, I remember we have a great many listeners who live in and around the United Kingdom, saying that, they were raised in sort of like dirt floor houses with just burning wood ovens up until, the 60s, right? It wasn't uncommon to raise a family in something like the Great Depression, right? And then you would hear them describe, they had the hearth, they had the gun, the rifle passed down from generation to generation. This isn't something from 700 years ago, right? So, and just hearing how that tradition probably broke within one generation. And so now you have the invading army and no one's even tracking it. And that's described in the book as well. It was called The Last Chance Armada. That was the name given to it in the book. And this was inspired by artists in the West saying, trying to give some romanticism to it. This is what I was talking about before on what was driving the force. It says, the Last Chance Armada, en route to the West, was feeding on hatred, a hatred of almost philosophical proportions, so utter, so absolute, that it had no thoughts of revenge or blood or death, but merely consigned its objects to the ultimate void. In this case, the whites. From the Ganges refugees on the way to Europe, the whites had simply ceased to be. They no longer existed. Paradise had already changed hands, and hatred made faith all the stronger, which is what Clemendio was trying to suggest without showing his colors or theirs. No compromise for the Ganges refugees. And here's another line from later in the book. It says, it crushed them to pulp just because they were there. Ganges monsters, Western monks. It made no distinction. It saw itself now as the one and only race. All others, quite simply, had ceased to exist. The Frontingumber monks died, and we're describing some monks later in the book, died not because they were white, but only because they were standing in the way. Not at all like the victims of the Gata affair, white strangers, members of an alien race, foreign bodies summarily rejected from the flesh. In fact, from Gata on, the woebegone fleet had begun to lose its loathing of the stranger. The emotion no longer served any purpose. It had simply dissolved and melted away, much the same as with the Africans massed up in Limpopo, the Chinese along the Amur, the swarthy millions roaming the streets of New York and London, or the myriad blacks and Arabs ready to spew from the cellars of Paris. For them, the Gata dead spelled the end of the white race in toto. And that was that. It would have had to rise miraculously from its ashes before they would give it a second thought now. And obviously, there on the southern coast of France, nothing of that sort was about to happen. And that to me was maybe the most poignant segment near the end of the book, really trying to not psychoanalyze the mass, but let the reader know that this is happening because the fight has already been surrendered. And that is, in fact, how they see it. And I think that is true now. I think when the mass migrations occur now into Europe, into Canada, into America less, but mainly Canada and Europe, they see this as victory. They see themselves as above us. We are like resources to them. They don't even identify. They pity us. Right?
Right.
They don't. They don't see. Yeah.
They see they see it as an inheritance that they have inherited a great civilization, and they just have to wait us out.
They think we're cowards for not fighting back, and because we're cowards, we deserve whatever happens to us. And in a way, they're right.
Oh, they're in a way they're right.
Because there's no rights. There's no rights. It's only what you have. That's what sovereignty is. It's what you can defend, either with force or implied force. So we're lacking all of that. And so the most obvious thing in the world happens, the most predictable thing in the world happens. And they're not sorry. They don't even think about us. And that's what was sort of driving the recent discourse over H-1B visas and stuff. It's like they didn't think we knew what was going on. They thought we were just dumb cowards.
Stupid. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is what was fascinating about this book, even though it seems like it's extreme, I really don't think it's as extreme as many think.
Yeah, I don't think so either. It's unkind, definitely, to especially Indians, but you can't call him a liar. You can't say that he was exaggerating.
Here's a line that lends to that. It says, the poor little consul looked rather like a tired old magician who knows that he's going to bungle the trick and does, but who tries it on the audience all the same, not for his honor or anything of the sort, but because even a worn-out magician deserves an orderly end, however absurd, just as a worn-out hero of the Western world deserves to perform one last bizarre, eccentric feat for the public that used to applaud him. Once admiration gives way to disdain, the bizarre, after all, is the only way that makes much sense. And why not? Weren't jesters always cleverer than their kings? So be it. In this new swarthy reign, the white man will be the jester. It's as simple as that. And that was from early on in the book, but I do think that that's a thread throughout the entire thing, right up until the last stand.
Most definitely. Dimes, I have one question for you. Why do people hate civilization?
That's a good question. I think the entire concept of civilization is not fully understood by anyone other than those who create it. So I think it would be wrong, and this is a great book that expresses that, it would be wrong to say that these people hate civilization. They just know that over here, there's things that I want that are being kept from me. I don't understand why they're being kept from me. So on our side, on the side of civilization, we would assign no shortage of theory or even morality to that by saying, oh, they desire an egalitarian world. They desire equality, a redistribution of wealth because they think it's unjust. No, they don't understand justice. They don't understand egalitarianism. They don't fucking understand theory. They understand instinct. They understand desire. I want. Someone told them that there's free pussy over there, and they want to take it. And if it's being kept from them, they're going to fight whoever's keeping it from them. That's about what they understand. So they don't have a concept. I always had this example that, Americans, Europeans probably, but Americans wanted to go to the moon because it was there, because it was the undiscovered country, because it is our, for better or worse, our Faustian spirit that demands that we charter flights of all kinds into the darkness to have a hostile relationship with the unknown. That's why we went to space. Everyone else went to space because white people did it. India, absent white people in the world, India wouldn't go to fucking space. They wouldn't make satellites. They wouldn't desire this. That desire is not inherent in any other group. Let's just say that. But and that's used against Europeans. That is,
in fact, they're just trying to keep up.
That is a grievance levied against us. They'll say, why do white people do that? Why do white people want to climb mountains? I hear that all the time. Here goes white people climbing Mount Everest. Why? What's up there? Like, they don't get it. They'll never fucking get it. They don't understand why you want to climb a mountain because it's there. They don't understand why we want to go to the bottom of the ocean. Listen to
why aren't you in a group chat for 12 hours a day with your extended family, just everybody on the phone?
why don't you have your three aunties chattering in your ear at all times because you lack the ability to exist without someone filling your brain with chatter. You know what I mean? But it's like they don't understand why we do these things. They think it's silly. They make fun of us for it. And, as I've gone through life, I've noticed that. And then I've stopped saying, oh, we're stupid. Why do we do that? Why are white people like that? That's what liberals say. That's what the Bill Burrs and the Louis
Right.
C.K.'s of the
Oh
world
God.
say. But I get it. And I think that makes us special. And so to answer your question, I don't think they see it as civilization. I think they just see it as something that they don't have and that they want, which makes them inferior caretakers. And don't talk to me about how they were caretakers 700 years ago. I'm sure, hey, you guys invented zero. Real fucking happy for you. Like if you think I'm going to trust our great museums and our great works to you people, no, fuck off. And it's not up to me, of course. Who am I? I'm not God Emperor. I'm not a
Yet.
billionaire. What do I say? But I'm just saying, if it were up to me, like I would not trust I'm not a third worldist. I don't believe in this political movement that, just everyone's pretty much the same and we can be ethno nationalists, but leave each other alone. I'm like, this is a fucking pipe dream. If you think like a mainland Chinese person is going to be running the same operating system as I am, fuck off.
I don't have much to add to that.
Yeah, like honestly, like take
Cosine, cosine.
guys, ask these people a question. What do you think should be done with Haiti? If the existence of Haiti does not offend you to the very depths of your soul, then maybe we're going to be at odds. We must part ways. You know what I mean?
And that's the thing too, is that as soon as you say that, the gut instinct of anybody who wants to keep whatever together, right, or wants to see the ship burn down, if you suggest, okay, I'm just going to go over here and do my own thing, right, and I think that is more offensive to them than 1,000 Hades.
Yeah, and also just to circle back to your question, um, I'm trying to think of where I read this. There's actually a source for this claim, but South America is a great example of this. LA is another great example where you see some of the most profound violence when the wealthy is stacked right beside the impoverished. There's relatively less crime if the entire area is just poor. But there's something about the proximity of wealth next to the favelas that inspires like seething anger. So it's just the knowledge that that's there that drives them. There's a line from Camp of the Saints. I've got it right here. It says, a prodigious interest in this vanguard of an anti-world bent on coming in the flesh to knock at long last at the gates of abundance. So part of it's the mythologization of this, and part of this is class consciousness that's installed in them from outside actors. There's like the NGOs or the revolutionaries who are whipping them up into a frenzy, whereas otherwise they would just be inert peasants, right? But there is something where they just want to destroy it because it's beautiful, and they know they're not. And that's something later in the book when the man whose wife was gang raped, he's on the beach and he sees the turd eater come, and a whole column of these other refugees, these invaders. He waves to them, and they go up to him, and the giant just picks him up, and the little monster lets out a screech, and they just like crush him and kill him. And then it opines that the reason they did that wasn't because of anything other. It could have been because he was beautiful. They came across this beautiful thing, and they had to destroy it because deep down they know that they're not. They know they're reeking and stinking and ugly, and they cannot live in proximity to that. So that could be another thing. Now, how that would drive them from across the world into Europe, maybe blame telecommunications, that they're exposed constantly to this world that they know they're not a part of. And that drives their jealousy, but I don't think it's as simple as jealousy either. Some people say they hate us because they ain't us. It's something
It might
deeper than that.
might be something more akin to, it's not hatred, it's entropy.
True. Like at the end of the day, it's like there's more of us than there are of them. They are an entropic, he describes it as an anti-world force, but
Like a
yeah.
tsunami doesn't hate the village that it's crushing. It
And
just
recall that it's only made that way because of the forces of the Western world. Like we returned to earlier in the book, where these people are creating more babies because they want to send them to the West. So now you just have all these extra babies that are just left around. So it's like you are helping with every dollar you invest in Africa, you're driving up that birth rate. If you turned off that spigot of capital over Africa, the birth rate would plummet like really critically within a couple of generations. Everyone knows that. But it's our charity, it is our goodwill that is propping up these populations just because you won't let them combust from the inside. So we are engineering this mass that will inevitably see our kindness as weakness. I really think that's the underlying message of the book. It's our kindness is seen as weakness. You will not be thanked. You will not be redeemed. You will not be
you will
celebrated.
not be redeemed.
Yeah, you will not be. Do you will not redeem? But they will swarm you.
No, do not redeem.
And not only that, they will rewrite the history so that you were the aggressors and they were the victors.
But
So
no, it's worse than that. They're not going to write it down.
well, they say in the
There's
book that like the history was rewritten because there's sort of like a third worldist regime change throughout the world, that like there's an anti-racist museum at the UN's headquarters in Hanoi that's telling the story of like how the Western world deserved everything it got, like shit like that. So
right, but that's also just set up by the NGOs. Like, we have no idea what happened to the Ganges River civilization, or the Indus River civilization, rather. Like, we know it was there at one point, and then it was gone, and we don't really know a whole lot about it, right? Because nobody wrote it down.
true. They're not illiterate people.
Uh, I have one thing I want to tell you. I'm gonna have to tell you offline because it's pretty doxy. But Times, where can people find you? I
Yes,
think it's best if we stop here.
of course. First of all, let me just say this has been a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I thank you for inspiring me to finally get around to reading this book. I'm very happy I did. And if we can spread the word about this book and let people know that it is something that will impact them in the positive, even if it's in the negative at the outset. It's something that I feel happy that we did. Bloodsatellite.ca is the main website. There you can find links to all of our full episodes of the show. I also run a publishing outlet called the Vanguardist Journal. That's on Substack. Vanguardist Journal, that's substack.com. Also a store for merchandise from myself and many other creators, including Jay Burden and the Z-Man. Goodsuffer.com. And be sure to check out this little short documentary that I helped produce with a team of people from our scene that actually relates to what we've just been talking about. It's called Paving Over the Public. It's about the Canadian mass migration throughout the 20th century. And much like this book, the clandestine machinations of the political and journalist class to engineer a multicultural Canada, despite public opinion polls routinely taken throughout the century being against mass migration. So it's a very well produced, a sort of mainstream, show it to your friends and they'll kind of get this story called Paving Over the Public. You can search that up on YouTube, and that's it. I won't load you up with any more.
I will definitely link those below. I saw the documentary. Great job.
Thank you.
We probably could have done another half hour on that alone, and maybe we will in the future. I know that you guys do the replay, so I'm going to try and shill a little bit better than I usually do. I'm usually pretty lazy with shilling on my own podcast. So doubledealer.substack.com, where you can find this podcast, the RSS feed. We also have magazines out. Issue 14 is in the works right now. Help support our guys, artists and writers. We haven't made any money off of this. it literally all it comes in and it goes out to guys in our scene. So definitely a worthwhile cause.
And let me just say this: I like the Double Dealer. I recommend it to people, and some of the people I know that I respect the most really, really like the Double Dealer. Like it is got a reputation as one of the premier magazines, like fiction outlets in our space. So nothing but good things to say about the Double Dealer.
Well, we're trying. Yeah, it's we definitely could use your support. You can become a paid subscriber on our Substack. You'll get your very own episode of Canon Fodder. You can make me read, the worst crap in the world. You can help me read something as profound as, say, Tolstoy and Anna Karenina. It's really up to you. I leave that completely in your court. So go ahead and become a paid subscriber over there. I've partnered with Tukey's Magazine, or Tukey's Mag rather, to do a show called The Library of Mass Destruction. Myself and Capitalissimo, we go over, schizo books. I paint with a broad brush there, but don't think anything conspiracy related. And we're in the middle of Aberration in the Heartland of the Real, The Secret Lives of Timothy McVeigh. We're on, I think, 15 episodes right now, each of them like 3 hours long. So it's a long book, and we obviously pause to argue like an old married couple.
I want to read this book. I'm looking at it right now. This looks wild.
It's awesome. It really is. And Wendy Painting does a terrific job of. She has gone into more detail than any other book that I have read, especially about these subjects. Tom O'Neill wrote Chaos, and that is, everybody. Joe Rogan had Tom O'Neill on. They talk about chaos, right? And he talks about how it's so well researched, it's so well documented. You really got to the heart of the Manson stuff. Painting has done that, but for the Oklahoma City bombing, I think. And there's still more stuff. I think she's working on a sequel right now. This originally started off, I think, as her PhD thesis. So she put in a lot of work, and it's hard for me to compliment. I won't go there, but yeah, no, it's really, really great book. Highly recommend it. And Cap and I think, do a good job of making it entertaining as well.
Everyone on this space, everyone's reading wild shit and making good content based off it.
Yeah. So, that's all I've got. I've got a couple books out. You can find me on Twitter at @TR_Hudson. I don't really know how to end podcasts, so go ahead and cue the Frasier theme song.
All right, man. Thanks so much for taking the time. I had an amazing time and we're going to do it again soon, if I recall.
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah.
Soon,
because I know we're going to do 3 Body Problem at some point.
Oh, that's right. Yes. All right.
But I need to read that. I haven't even started that, but I'm going to get to that. So give me a little bit of time.